Welcome to News from Neptune for September 20th in the 38th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to a generation and more of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Five Little Peppers and How They Grew edition. By pepper here, I mean not just a...
I'm not old enough for that reference. But
the children's books, well, unfortunately you are in a modern sense of pepper. Pepper has come to mean progressive except for Palestine.
Oh, I see. Oh, pepper. Okay.
Yes.
Write it on tissue paper next time so I can see through it.
There are plenty of peppers around, and one wrote a letter this week in the News-Gazette that attacked you specifically. So,
criticized me.
Criticized you.
Attacked maybe is a little...
Time to get...
Not that sensitive,
Get to know your peppers, David.
Yeah, okay.
You've been talking about a pepper organization, certainly, Bend the Arc.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I have.
You want to take up...
that's
what the letter was about.
Yeah, my letter was critical of them, not just for their... the Palestinian part is an obvious aspect of that, but it's not even the most important aspect in some senses. The most important thing is that they're a sort of neoliberal Democratic Party identity politics front to oppose Bernie Sanders. I think that's pretty transparent in the way they're going about their business if you look at both the national website and the local website and some of the news items that they've linked to on their local website. They're just not, they just have their usual laundry list of causes while avoiding any material or structural analysis of what is actually going on. Their justification is that they are a national Jewish organization focused on U.S. politics to the exclusion of global politics. And that's a pretty big tell when it comes to what they're really up to. So their views and their causes are very predictable in that context. The most central one, at both the national and local levels, is of course immigrant rights, and I think immigrants and that issue. And we're focusing mostly on Latin American immigrants. We never really talk about immigrants in a kind of empirically sort of accurate way, because there's clearly different groups that we're talking about, both in terms of where they come from and where they arrive at in this culture, but. Their tactic is, of course, it's terrible the way immigrants have been treated, but they're using that as a part of their basically pro-Democratic Party, pro-neoliberal Democratic Party, anti-Trump strategy. They bring in anti-Semitism in an overwrought way. which I don't think is merited, even in spite of the Pittsburgh shooting and so forth from last year. Pretty much reflecting mainstream Democratic Party liberal views. And Belden Fields was, of course, arguing that we need to work with them on this particular cause, even though he claims to be pro-Palestine. I think my pro-Palestine is a little different from his pro-Palestine. If Bend the Arc was a group that just focused on immigrant rights or maybe a couple of other causes, it would be well and good for people who support that cause to work with them. But they make it very clear on their national and local websites in very grandiose language that they promote a political strategy, an overall national political strategy, and that is to keep mainstream Democrats running this country in lieu of Donald Trump. And that isn't a strategy that I want to subscribe to.
And to put this in relationship to the Sanders campaign, there was a comment by someone I find myself not too often agreeing with, Eric Greitzer, who writes for Counterpunch, but it says, I think quite rightly, that feeling that Bernie people are expressing is not fear of losing. It's not anxiety over a good campaign. It's not questioning their own commitment. It's the collective recognition that the ruling class has made its choice, and her name is Warren.
Yes.
I think Dreitzer's right about that.
David Brooks is for Warren.
And they're, in order to protect themselves from the threat of Bernie Sanders, they have rallied behind, but they, here I mean the Democratic Party as part of the general political establishment, they've rallied behind Warren as they hope to do behind Kamala Harris. But once Tulsi Gabbard destroyed Kamala Harris, they looked around for another woman who can pick up the mantle of Hillary Clinton and the mantle of endorsement by the political establishment and run with it. And her name is Warren, as Dreitzer says. I think that's right. I think that Jeffrey Sinclair at Counterpunch is right when he comments, is it any surprise that the party of the ruling class would select its favorite or second favorite as its candidate? The only real surprise is that Bernie dragged his troops through the charade one more time, expecting a different result. But where do they go? Bernie could have spent the last 4 years building an independent party or taking over the wreckage of the Greens. Instead, he spent it recruiting young progressives into the same party that had just drawn and quartered him. Jeffrey Sinclair wrote about the fall of the Sanders campaign in the last presidential election, and he saw it as a terrible example of putting your hand to the plow and looking back. And here the Sanders campaign seems to be doing the same thing again. If there's no alternative than the Democrats, then Sanders should admit it, drop all of the socialist pretense, and stop whining about leaks and how he's been screwed over by arbitrary rules enforced by the party elites. This is it. You're stuck with it. The best was long ago. Sorry, kids, you're destroyed. Best of luck, Gramps. That's why Ralph Nader has always been the superior political leader. Ralph was never under the illusion that the Democratic Party could be revolutionized from within, especially when the revolutionary ends up supporting the ruling class candidate in the end, as Bernie did, and Jeffrey suggests will probably do again when that candidate emerges as Elizabeth Warren. I'm afraid that's right.
Yeah. What was I going to say? There's just so much going on.
We've seen it all before.
There's so many aspects to this strategy that, what I was going to say is also look at the manner in which the New York Times covers the Sanders campaign with this woman named Sydney Ember, who's got her own hedge fund connections in her family and ends up writing for the New York Times and ends up providing this jaundiced coverage of the Bernie Sanders campaign. I think he did a rally in Chapel Hill that she covered in the last day or two. And I'm sure somebody who's on her case in a very good way, the blogger and podcaster Katie Halper out of New York City, a very Jewishly woman, very in her sense of humor and so forth, who is all over Sydney Ember. I think she's written an article on fair.org about the way that she's covering Sanders. She's talked about it on her own podcast, also on the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast with Rania Khalek. So if you want to read about just how awful this woman is and how blatantly biased her supposedly reporting is on Bernie Sanders, you can look her up.
Sanders has, of course, done something worthwhile in reintroducing discussion of socialism with a lowercase s into American political discussion and championing some important reforms that should indeed be undertaken, like Medicare for all. But the unhappiness with Sanders comes from his unwillingness to break with the important concerns of the American elite as expressed by the political establishment, including the party organizations. We need more of Bernie in that regard, not less. And what we're about to see, apparently, is an acquiescence into the party's nomination of Elizabeth Warren, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Just to get back maybe to the local letters to the editor scorecard here, so our viewers to unravel this a little bit. And I hope that I'm going to consider carrying this on in a future letter. In response to the Bend the Arc protests at Rodney Davis's office and their criticism of Rodney Davis, et cetera, as well, they do that as well as just doing the sort of no more cages kind of thing. They got a response. They got a critical response, according to Belden, and according to a certain extent, he's right, from the quote-unquote other side. My dear old friend Paul Weichsel, a ardent local Zionist, wrote a letter, but he said one true thing in that letter, and he said, Donald Trump isn't an anti-Semite. Bend the Arc wants. I don't think Donald Trump is an anti-Semite in any serious rendering of that term. He's got obviously many other issues, but this whole business that the Bend the Arc tried to blow up, this comment they made about loyalty, which had nothing to do with questioning American Jews' loyalty to this country, that doesn't make him an anti-Semite. Paul was right in saying that, and of course, he doesn't, as a kind of a liberal Zionist, he's kind of trying to fine-tune that to a certain extent. Meanwhile, a Republican Jewish woman, quote-unquote Republican Jewish woman, Sherry Steigman, wrote a letter harshly critical of Bend the Arc, accusing them of being pro-Palestinian and blah, blah, blah. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And Belden mentioned her in his letter and tried to set himself up as being the moderate force between me on the here I'll do it right here. Me on the stage left, and Sherry Steigman on stage right, and that doesn't work for me either, Carl, because it's just like, don't do that, Belden. don't set yourself up as being the moderate in the room when we're talking about a group that basically supports war and that supports neoliberal policies. And all you have to do is read their namby-pamby, intersectional, laundry list, identity politics website to know that there isn't any substance of what Bend the Arc is saying. And I don't care if it's fine if they have a cause that they're organizing Jewish people for to focus on that, fine. I don't think the pro-immigrant movement is really doing all that much here, but it's doing something. They contradiction to what Belden said, he's saying people should work with them, even if they don't, even if we don't agree with them about everything. But from what I understand, Ben the Ark didn't want to work with the broader coalition of groups a year or so ago when there was an anti-ICE alley planned at the Drury Inn. That was last year, actually, on June 30th. They didn't want to participate in that because people like me, people like Aware, and a couple of the other leftist groups in town were all like DSA were also participating in that. So Ben the Ark has actually decided that there are people they can't work with. So that discredits them for obvious reasons. I could be wrong about that, but that's what my sources told me at that time. And my sources were actually there
Yeah.
at these planning meetings. So this is all just a big diversion from what our real problems are, including how the immigrant issue ought to be dealt with. And I have some comments about that, but I want to kind of bracket that, as we move on.
Well, two brief comments on what's been said so far. The first is that on the local scene, the peculiar fact is that the one forum in town where you're likely to hear arguments on this issue, different positions on this issue, and not just one, is the letters column of the News-Gazette. This is quite remarkable in a lot of ways, given the ownership of the News-Gazette. But the ownership of the News-Gazette has just changed, and it's not at all clear whether the new owners will maintain the sort of diversity, in one sense of the word, that has characterized their letters column. I hope they do. I think it's worthwhile, even though we've taken issue with editorial stances of the News-Gazette frequently. The fact of the matter is that David's letters and mine, and those of some other peppers, as we were saying, progressives except for Palestine, all of these appear in the News-Gazette, along with some other absolutely crazy stuff, and that's all to the good. I hope they keep that up. Second point, I was impressed this week with a peculiar terminological problem that we have in discussing these matters. David has said that his objection to Beyond the Ark includes
Ben the Ark.
Beyond.
They're not going beyond the Ark. Not yet, anyway.
We've been having trouble getting the title right.
Behind the Ark, Beyond the Ark, whatever.
Behind the Ark, exactly.
So far, we're just bent.
We're not going to be able to say it right anymore now.
Right.
What's the euphemism you suggest? BTA?
Right, BTA.
We'll just call that BDS, right?
PEP, BTA.
David has described it as supporting neoliberal politics. And I had an interesting discussion this week with a sophisticated and well-informed interlocutor. And I suddenly realized that they were using the terms neoliberal and neoconservative to mean very liberal and very conservative. And not just liberal and conservative as it used to be in Ronald Reagan's time, say, but beyond that now. I remember the beyond, that's getting the Beyond the Ark problem again. The notion that neoliberal means very liberal and neoconservative means very conservative is amazing confusion. And we can see how that confusion has come about. But when we speak of neoliberal policies that have characterized all presidential administrations for 40 years, what we're referring to is what is elsewhere called market fundamentalism, the financialization of the economy, the offshoring of the U.S. economy, and the abandonment of the attempts that go back to the New Deal of trying to take the hard edge off American capitalism. Neoliberalism wants to put it back on. Neoliberalism is the assertion of market fundamentalism, that money rules, and that any attempts to interfere with that or to modify that is to be opposed. And those are the policies most notably in the last presidential administration, which promised hope and change, and then produced a serious neoliberal program to the delight of the American elite, the American 1%, an absolutely shameful affair that produced finally Donald Trump and the objections to those economic strictures of the Obama administration. So when we say neoliberal, we don't mean very liberal. We mean oppressive and exploitative American
We
capitalism.
mean very capitalist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And when we say neoconservative, we mean very warlike.
Exactly.
To distinguish the modern conservative of the 1970s, the pro-Israel conservatism of it was really the pro-Israel liberalism of the 1970s that became the conservatism, especially among, it's often called Jewish conservatism, although you can be called an anti-Semite for saying that.
Yes.
You can't call me an anti-Semite for saying that. But anyway, they were Democrats who decided that post-Vietnam that the Democrats weren't being hawkish enough. So out of that we get Norman Podhoretz and Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and Martin Peretz and the whole gang. So out of these policies, what we get is what we also get in this context is an immigration policy, which while it's outsourcing jobs to the rest of the world, is also bringing both skilled and unskilled labor into this country, whether as a result of economic displacement, as in Latin America, or as war in Central America, or as war the Middle East, or as just general economic policy, sort of brain drain, educational related brain drain type of policy, as in Asia and South Asia. So immigrants are a very diverse, to use that word, in an authentic sense, and complicated group. But the manner in which groups like Bend the Arc deal with one group of that in this way that is obviously morally, they can claim a certain moral righteousness in doing so. What it does is really confuse the entire issue of how immigrants are thought of and what they are, quote, being used for. And what I had meant to do on last week before we got on other things, and we didn't actually get that show up anyway because there was technical issues.
Not my fault.
Which were completely Carl's fault. No, not really. Don't repeat that. But I wanted to, I just wanted to briefly refer to what I consider to be a kind of an awful commentary article that appeared in the News-Gazette on September 10th, Building a Welcoming Economy by Mike Doyle and Craig Rost. Mike Doyle is the executive director of the University YMCA. Craig Rost, R-O-S-T, is the former executive director of the Champaign County Economic Development Corporation. Two local scions who write a supposedly reputable article about welcoming immigrants to work in this country and in this state and in this community. And I'm not going to go into part. Yeah, pardon.
No, I'm just going to say that puts me in. That's not 1619 you're talking about.
Pardon.
This is today, not
today, not 1619 when the first slaves arrived in this country.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, most people read this article. Well, yes, this is a nice article to write about settling immigrants in the heartland of this country where they're losing populations. This is a nice article about welcoming skilled immigrants here who come with certain technical skills, but I have a serious problem with this, and this is why the Bend the Arc the bend the arc moralistic approach, to put a kind word on it. Moralistic approach just doesn't do it for me, because we're not understanding where this problem is coming from and how are these people being treated. And the bottom line of this article, really, building a welcoming economy, is that welcome to the exploitation of your labor. You know, and say, well, yeah, these people need jobs, everybody wants jobs, blah, blah, blah. No, this isn't how to solve the depopulation problem, which they don't get right at all. But anyway, this isn't how to deal with that. This isn't how to deal with it. This isn't how to deal with. They refer again to this county, which there's not a depopulation problem. There's a too few worker problem. Why aren't there enough workers? Well, how about raising their pay, attracting more workers? No, labor markets are only for capitalists. They're not for workers. You know, this article is just full of holes, and they were publicizing this meeting that they were having, which actually took place last Friday. Just so confused and so ultimately neoliberal, and so sort of unquestioning about certain shibboleths we have about what's going on with immigrants in this country, and I see that. And one last thing just to say in this context is that what this discourse seems to be doing is bifurcating the African American poverty problem, or the general poverty, but especially in our community, the African American poverty problem with the immigrant, quote unquote, problem. And the African Americans are being, this is what puts me into mind of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous phrase from the 1960s, benign neglect, treating the African American population. And in this discourse on the liberals, the allegedly liberal progressive side of things around here, what we have is immigrants talked about over here, blacks talked about over here. And the blacks, I haven't heard Carol or Aaron Ammons say anything about the immigrant problem, but I also haven't heard them at least say, why is all this attention being devoted to this problem when we've got an impoverished African American community here that people are just throwing nice words at? Maybe it's because they're the ones throwing nice words at it. Maybe that sounds a little harsh, but there are things under the carpet here. There are things not being talked about because of this neoliberal agenda. And bend the arc, whether they want to or not, they're at the middle of all this hypocritical and sort of exploitative discourse, not to mention the labor exploitation, not to mention the wars behind all that.
If we're talking about a welcoming economy, too, we might see the extent to which that criticizes what the U.S. actually does in regard to the world economy. Most people recognize that the American relationship to the world economy is in a critical phase these days in the long arc, forgive the expression, running from the Second World War to the present. But if the U.S. were really a welcoming economy rather than a declining empire, which is probably the case, one of the first things it would do would associate itself with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Instead, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is seen as a major threat to the United States, and the U.S. does a great deal up to and including making war in order to oppose the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is the long-term Chinese project to develop economic connections literally around the world. Hence the belt, that is the land-based transportation, the sea-based transportation, and the road, the land-based transportation, between the Chinese economy and the economies of the rest of the world. The U.S. government, the U.S. political establishment, perceives this as a threat and does its best to discourage these economic connections. That's part of the present so-called tariff war with China. It's much more than just tariffs at stake. It is the question of economic connection around the world. A welcoming economy, which China means its Belt and Road Initiative to be, a welcoming economy in the U.S. would cooperate with this. And instead, it's a fundamental threat, or so it's seen by the American government.
Just the second paragraph in this article, Building a Welcoming Economy, goes, it's just one sentence. It goes as follows. Across America, despite growing anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies, pragmatic business and community leaders are turning to immigration and immigrants to help with current economic challenges. Okay, and it just, I mean, that it seems benign enough,
yes.
But there's a whole backstory to this. Rural America, agricultural America, deindustrialized America, they need these kind of policies you're referring to. They need a Green New Deal. They need federal programs, infrastructure programs to put people to work. Immigrants are not going to solve this problem. And what about, and no wonder people in those areas vote for Trump if they hear rhetoric like this. Anybody living in one of these counties, Decatur, Peoria, whatever, reads this and says, what about me? They rightfully say, what about me? It doesn't matter, what they think about black people, immigrants, Mexicans, whatever. They say, what about me? And they rightfully say, what about me? We need an actual economic program in this country, not nonsense like this. And these guys might say, well, this isn't the only thing that we need, blah, blah, blah. Why are they focusing on this? Because that's what's bien, how do you say it? Bien pensant. That's what the fine-minded, good-minded, high-minded people are saying now. That's what they're doing now to sound morally, professional people. They're sounding morally pure. They're not dealing. I mean, I'm sorry, Mike Doyle, the executive director of the University Y. He has this great reputation for being this great social activist. He's just sold out. I don't know that he ever sold in, but this isn't the kind of thing that they should be focusing on. And of course, I understand the University Y is more focused on the quote unquote diverse student population. They do a lot with students from other countries, okay, and so forth. Again, what about the African Americans? Do we just put these in two different categories? Say, well, I'm going to deal with these and you guys can deal with those. No, we've got to have somebody to deal with the whole thing. On campus, off campus, in rural areas, whatever.
You're going to get more letters, David.
I welcome them. There isn't enough discourse about these things, and that's because the Bend the Arc people, they don't really want to have discourse. They just want to get on their moral high ground. And somebody like Belden Fields ought to be saying, okay, let's talk about this. And saying, well, I'm with them and you should be with them too, and case closed.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a variety of topics to talk about, ranging from the local to the general. And our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, sends in another example of the sorts of obfuscation we're getting from the American political establishment, particularly the Democrats. Jeff writes, the Democrats claim they want to ban fracking, but should we believe them? Senator Bernie Sanders posted, quote, any proposal to avert the climate crisis must include a full fracking ban on public and private lands, close quote. But according to OpenSecrets.org, which tracks stuff like this.
I thought you were about to say Oprah Winfrey. I'm sorry.
No, her secrets are not open, I don't think.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders took $5,000 in individual contributions from oil and gas-connected sources in his 2018 campaign, and he did in 2016 as well.
How much money?
5,019.
Is that a misprint? I mean, that's not much money.
Individual contributions, the average contribution from oil and gas-connected sources, I think. Senator Elizabeth Warren has said, on my first day as president, I will sign an executive order that puts a total moratorium on all new fossil fuel leases for drilling offshore and on public lands, and I will ban fracking everywhere. This is close quote. That's her promise. Is that really going to challenge the power of federal law? In other words, can they get away with it? Can an executive order override federal laws that allow these activities on public lands? An executive order can certainly prohibit agencies from doing what they would otherwise be allowed to do, but not what they're required to do by law. The quoted article refers to federally mandated quarterly lease sales. That seems to be a reference to the Mineral Leasing Act, required for quarterly sales of parcels that are, quote, available, close quote, for lease. An executive order could probably stop further designations. It might take more to redesignate currently available but unleased lands as unavailable. In other words, what we're dealing with here is not a matter of presidential decision making. One of the fell contributions of the Trump administration has been the notion that the president can order various things and have them occur. This is peculiar and interesting, given that Trump is probably the weakest American president we've had literally in generations. But the question of suddenly doing something about the great problem, the great climate problems involved in fracking, may be, once again, window dressing. Pleasant promises of a hope and change, to coin a phrase, and that cannot have any real effect without the support of Congress. So that these presidential discussions sound nice, but are perhaps not effective. Even Kamala Harris said, "There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking." Oh, okay, I'm sure. But she has a mixed...
There's no question we can't believe a word you say, Kamala Harris.
Well, it seems more and more people are coming to that conclusion. Kamala Harris has a mixed record, to put it more harshly, on working in the public's interest against oil companies. She claimed at a recent CNN climate town hall that she sued ExxonMobil.
Right.
But there's no evidence that she did.
Right.
Harris opened an investigation into Exxon when she was Attorney General in California, opened an investigation into Exxon for lying about climate change, but she didn't take it any further. She could have, and she should have, filed a lawsuit like the Attorney General of New York did. What would you do, Aaron Burnett, a CNN moderator asked? Would you sue them? Would you sue ExxonMobil? Oh, I have sued ExxonMobil, Ms. Harris replied. Not quite. An investigation, yes. A lawsuit, no. In 2016, the Los Angeles Times reported that Ms. Harris, when California's Attorney General, had begun an investigation, quote, into whether ExxonMobil Corporation repeatedly lied to the public and its shareholders about the risk to its business from climate change and whether such actions could amount to securities fraud and violations of environmental laws. All sounds good, eh? The New York Times reported the existence of the investigation the next day. Both articles cited people with knowledge of the inquiry, though Ms. Harris' office did not confirm it. But after that, no progress came to light. No case was ever filed. Eventually, the reported inquiry passed on to Ms. Harris' successor, Javier Becerra, who has also not brought a suit. The Harris campaign spokesman wrote to a news organization that Harris, quote, obtained $50 million in settlements from oil companies she took on, like BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Phillips 66. She also announced criminal indictments against Plains Pipeline for the massive oil spill they caused off the coast of Santa Barbara. The case continued after Harris left the Attorney General's office and resulted in a conviction. This seems to be what she's referring to, i.e., not things she did herself at all. In light of previous and interaction with oil companies, how seriously should we take these claims to ban fracking? Now, as I say, Harris' candidacy seems to be self-destructing with a little help from Tulsi Gabbard and others, in any case. But she clearly was the Democrats' Democrat Party's choice to take on the mantle of Hillary Clinton. And the failure of their fond hopes here seems to me the ascendancy, the ascent of Elizabeth Warren. Get ready
These are
vote for the neoliberal.
These are substantive issues about Harris. But as I presciently said a few weeks ago on News from Neptune, I just don't think that Harris has the sort of Obama-esque charismatic qualities that
Hillary Clinton
that we're going to care, or at least Hillary Clinton had the "I'm the first woman"
exactly,
type, and sure, we're still waiting for our first woman president. I'm sure when we get one, it's going to be a real doozy, isn't it, Carl?
Yeah.
Let me make one. Did you want to?
No. Go ahead.
I wanted to actually. You just sort of got me thinking about this. Kamala Harris speaking at AIPAC, blah blah blah. Whether it's going to be interesting to see whether any of the Democratic candidates speak at the AIPAC annual conference, which usually comes up, I think, in March, which will be right in the midst of the primary season next year. It's all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but because of the events of the last 3 or 4 years, become not de rigueur for Democrats to speak at AIPAC. And so it's going to be a basically political decision on their part as to whether to do so. And in that context, let me just get back a little bit to clarify about the PEP, since we're still doing our Peppers program, Bend the Arc business. I'm accusing these people of being liberal Zionists. I'm sure that's what they are. But what they're doing is they're changing the subject from Israel to anything else because they understand came to understand during the Obama years that Israel was doing things, that Netanyahu was doing things to undermine the support of liberal Jews in this country for the Jewish state, and with the help of Sheldon Adelson and the whole gang, and that Democrats, decent liberal Jewish Democrats, which these people still are, they're neoliberal, but they're liberal in their basic values. They want to be nice to everyone, and maybe they want a few social programs, okay. And they want identity politics, okay, but still, Israel, they're pro-Israel in the sense, not in the sense that they support it anymore, but they've gone on to the next stage was, let's not talk about it. Therefore, let's start a Jewish group that doesn't deal with foreign policy. This is a big change in Jewish life in this country. Jewish political life in this country used to be, for many years, from the 60s through relatively recently, was all about, do you support Israel first? Is it good for the Jews, including those in Israel, first? That's changed. So the Bend the Arc people are doing one thing. The Democratic candidates are, in a sense, doing the same thing because they're not talking about Israel, or if they do so, it's in very careful, guarded terms. And of course, this is all going to be played out in the context of, are we going to have new leadership in Israel based on the vote yesterday, which hasn't been decided yet. I refer you, as usual, to Jonathan Cook's article on various sites, including Counterpunch.
We'll put that on our Facebook page too. He does seem to be the best of the commentators available to us on the matter.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure Gideon Levy will probably, I think he's even quoted in that article, but he's quoted in some other article, and in fact, Amy Goodman still is good on the Israel-Palestine issue.
You're watching News from Neptune. The big story this week that we haven't really mentioned so far, and it's probably worth some commentary, is the attack on the Saudi oil refineries that has produced a variety of observations, some of them perhaps even true, and a real question about the nature of a war in the Mideast and of American policy which is peculiarly connected to questions of oil. The real reason that the U.S. Supports Israeli apartheid has little to do with white supremacy, as our identity politics friends say.
White nationalism, yes, as they're always saying, yeah.
That's nonsense, in fact, and a great deal to do with black supremacy, black in this case being the crude oil that the U.S. is concerned about fundamentally in the area, as not for its own purposes. Well, we steal our oil in the Western Hemisphere. The question of the control of energy flows around the world is vital to American foreign policy. We want to give it to our friends and keep it from our enemies. And the control of those energy resources, particularly those from the Persian Gulf, is a foundational point of American foreign policy.
And it's just, if I could just say this, it's important to note that the fracking, the fact that we want to frack and export natural gas, people think, well, doesn't that solve our energy problem if we're exporting it now? But no, it doesn't. The short answer, no. And you can look at, if you're in terms of the fracking, the Real News Network has done a couple of good stories on that recently, so look those up.
The attacks on the Saudi refineries, whoever sent them off, the U.S. government says the attacks were clearly done by Iran. The rest of the world thinks the attack was done by the Houthis in Yemen, which has been under vicious attack by the Saudi government for months and has all the best possible reasons for retaliating, particularly retaliation that does not kill innocent people, as the Saudis do regularly in Yemen, but attacks the industrial infrastructure, the oil wealth that Saudi government, Saudi control rests upon. So it's an interesting question that has not only political but a lot of technical implications as well. There are many people who argue, as the president of Russia did a year ago, that technical advances in weapons, and particularly control of the weapons available in the Middle East, has actually fundamentally changed the strategic situation. The standard media outlets are coming to recognize that. The Guardian, for example, the British paper that speaks for the neoliberal position, had an article entitled "Middle East Drones Signal End to Era of Fast Jet Air Supremacy." And talking particularly about the effects on people who read The Guardian of what these drones are doing, but the effects actually may be much broader than that. It's particularly interesting in light of anyone who might question a focus on drones in particular over any other kind of bombing. And there's a great argument about whether the attack on Saudi Arabia this week was done by drones or drones in combination, as seems to be the case with other kinds of bombing. Drones possess a unique economic and size advantage traditional bombers don't, obviously. Also consider the supportive rhetoric and choices of recent administrations on drones. George W. Bush used them. Obama scaled up their use sharply and caught the attention of Noam Chomsky, who called Obama's drone attacks, drone assassinations, quote, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, and Trump has followed suit, scaling up their use even further. In the history of modern warfare, own the skies, win the war has been a constant maxim. Countries with the best technology and biggest budgets had voted tens of billions to building modern air forces, confident they will continue to give their militaries primacy on almost any conflict. As the insightful Middle East commentator Pepe Escobar wrote this week, how many F-16s does it take to defeat Saudi militarism? And the answer was 0. the peculiar mix of weapons, including cruise missiles, drones, and perhaps even intermediate-range ballistic missiles used by whoever it was to put out half the refining capacity of Saudi Arabia, is a message to the combatants in the area, not least the United States, that the situation has changed. The weapons are not available in the way they were. The U.S. has relied upon its bomber fleets and its ships to control the Persian Gulf, the source of so much of the world's energy resources. And as the attacks this week point out, that era seems to have come to an end. That's not what's been commented upon in the press on this matter. What's been commented upon is when will the United States strike back at Iran for this act of war, to quote our Secretary of State. But the real issue may be a real change in the balance of power that's based on technology. And this may make a difference. Comments on the attacks on the Saudis?
I really don't have much to add to that, except I haven't followed it through in detail. I assume that all of the accusations are about who's behind it are relatively baseless and meaningless and done for political effect and geopolitical effect. So I tune that out to a certain extent because it's just noise, unless it gets to the point where, say, Netanyahu, as reported, I think Jonathan Cook reported that he considered attacking. Well, maybe it was he considered. This is a different topic. I'm sorry, but what Netanyahu did apparently do was consider attacking Gaza prior to the vote yesterday.
That's right.
But that's in the general context of Israel is at the middle of all this. It isn't the origins of all this, but it's at the middle of what all this demonization is, and all this Middle Eastern war making.
As we remarked, I think before, the run-up to the election in Israel suggests or includes increasingly hysterical actions by Benjamin Netanyahu, including the plans from which he apparently excluded his actual military chiefs, his plans to attack Gaza and get a full-scale war in Gaza. Apparently, cooler heads prevailed. Where those heads were coming from, I don't know. Apparently not his wife, if we believe the Israel lobby in the U.S. But in any case, as we said here, it looked like Netanyahu thought he was going to lose and was willing to do more and more dangerous things to prevent that from happening. In any case, it's not clear what the outcome of the Israeli election will be, but the untrammeled authority of Benjamin Netanyahu certainly seems to have come to an end. Whether this is good for peace and war, we don't know. The people who are going to replace him are no prizes and are as bad in their way as Netanyahu is himself, but without the colorful madness that we've come to expect from the Israeli government.
I like the way you say "no prizes." It rings of Jewish motherhood when you do that. He's no prize.
Probably that's an unconscious quotation.
Maybe that's what their mothers are saying about them at this very moment.
Maybe so.
Their Jewish mothers. It's always such a sort of fascinating contrast when you've got this. In Israel, you've got this parliamentary system in which people can form parties at will that you've never heard of, and all of a sudden they're players, and it's always been that way because of the parliamentary system. But also, it's basically, as Jonathan Cook or somebody else also pointed out, it's a one-party state. It's a Zionist party state, and even though the Arab list, the only truly alternative to the Zionist point of view, to this what's called sort of moderate Zionism or mid-level versus right-wing Zionism, but it's all Zionism, it's all racism, it's all occupation, it's all settlement. That's what Israel is now. So instead of being a many-party state in which supposedly we would wish for we would wish for something like that here, whether you could have a Green Party and a Socialist Party and a Communist Party. They've got all that. I mean, they don't have a Green Party. They have sort of a Communist Party that's part of the Arab list, but still, it's like what they've got is a one-party state.
We're talking about the vagaries of a parliamentary system. We might notice that the mother of parliaments, as it has styled itself, is showing certain strains along these lines itself these days. I'm talking about the British Parliament and the ongoing soap opera of Brexit, and that the activities of the government that tries to get along without a constitution, which may in fact be a very good idea, has its own attractions these days. At least it keeps you opening the newspaper in the morning to see what Bojo has done. That's fun. One more comment on the drones and the weapons being used to kill people in the Middle East. Bernie Sanders supported killer drones in an interview in 2016 on Meet the Press. Chuck Todd asked him, "What does counterterrorism look like in a Sanders administration? Drones, special forces, or what does it look like?" Bernie Sanders' answer was, "All of that and more." Chuck Todd says, "You're okay with the drone, using drones?" Sanders says, "Look, drone is a weapon. When it works badly, it's terrible, and it's counterproductive. When you blow up a facility or a building which kills women and children, you know what? Not only doesn't it do us any good, it's terrible." Chuck Todd says, "But you're comfortable with the idea of using drones if you think you've isolated an important terrorist?" Bernie Sanders, "Yes." Chuck Todd, "So that continues?" Bernie Sanders says, "Yes." Now this interview was uncovered by our researcher Jeff Nicholson, who compares it to interviews with Tulsi Gabbard, when those of us who want to say there is an anti-war candidate in this field get too big for our britches. But in any case, notion that Sanders' comments on foreign policy are generally reprehensible was borne out in the last Democratic debate with reference to Venezuela and the situation of the Maduro government, which was, after all, validly elected in Venezuela and is under terrible pressure from the Trump administration, was misrepresented, I think, by Sanders in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of foreign policy issues here that the Democratic establishment is finally willing to backtrack on, and we should not be surprised at that at all. It's happened before.
We've got just a couple of minutes left.
Okay.
Can I just squeeze this in?
Please do.
I've been dying to do this.
Okay.
In this morning's paper, a story about the U of I Board of Trustees meeting and the advice they gave to the immigrant immigrant president, or whatever he is, of the U of I, Tim Killeen. Quote, I'm quoting the story and also what the trustees are going to say. The story said, "They provided suggestions on diversity and inclusion, including, quote, viewpoint diversity, unquote, and encouraged Killeen to do all he could to make the UI a national leader in recruiting and retaining minority students and faculty," the report said. Further work to support diverse contractors and suppliers for the U of I was also a priority. Trustees advised Killeen to continue a push for affordability while maintaining admission standards. I'm not sure why those two things should be opposite to each other. They recognized the UI's growing revenue, improved marketing efforts, and Killeen's legislative advocacy, but added a note of caution about the state's pension deficits. And, ominously in the next paragraph, quote, "The trustees noted that sexual misconduct, hostile environment, and freedom of speech are nationwide issues, and encouraged the president to complete work with misconduct/harassment task forces with guidelines and policies that are consistent and fair, end quote, the report said. So there you have the mishmash of neoliberal identity politics nonsense that is contained in the manner in which the Board of Trustees advises the president of our state university.
It was quietly noted in the press this week that the Trump administration has directed the University of North Carolina and Duke to change its teach its program on international affairs because it portrays Islam too positively and asks for them to change or to risk losing funding. Anyone who lived at the University of Illinois during the Saleta affair will not be surprised, but the rest of the world might be. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 38th week of 2019, a Five Little Peppers and How They Grew edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook. We'll send you a list of the Five Little Peppers if you want, but they were in there.
The world is waiting for that.
News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson, and it's produced and directed by Jason Liggett. See research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.